The metallic groan of the engine died in the middle of the dirt road, and for a moment only the wind existed. She was kneeling in the mud, her knees staining the light silk of her dress, her hands trembling as she held the small, golden body that barely breathed. The dog, an indefinable mix of breeds she'd impulsively adopted from a Sunday market, shook between her fingers like a dry leaf. Despair rose in her throat, that kind of suffocating feeling that comes when money, for the first time, is utterly useless. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're following us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The road seemed endless under the heavy afternoon sky. Grey clouds gathered on the horizon, carrying the promise of rain that still hesitated to fall. The smell of dry earth mingled with the French perfume she wore, creating a strange, almost ironic combination. At 42, Helen Miller had learned to solve any emergency with a call, a credit card, a firm command. But here her cell phone had no signal, her expensive car was as dead as a museum piece, and the animal she had saved from a dubious situation at a market was dying in her hands. She looked around, searching for a house, any sign of human life. The dusty dirt road stretched in both directions, flanked by low fences and parched pasture land. A few sparse trees offered insufficient shade, and in the distance an uneven line of hills cut across the sky like an ancient scar. Nothing. Only the sound of the wind in the dry leaves and the dog's irregular breathing. She tried to remember how she had gotten there. The meeting in the neighboring town, the alternative route her GPS had suggested to avoid traffic, the loud music on the radio, the feeling of freedom she always felt when driving alone. And then, suddenly, the engine began to falter. The car slowed down, and when it finally stopped, the dog, who was traveling loose in the back seat against all her safety rules, had begun to convulse. Her hands, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, now trembled as she stroked the soft golden fur. The animal seemed smaller than it was, curled in pain, its glazed eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. She whispered nonsensical words, empty promises, as if the tone of her voice could make a difference. But the dog's breathing was growing weaker, and she felt she was losing a battle for which she had no weapons. That's when she heard the footsteps. They weren't hurried or curious steps. They were firm, measured, like someone who knew the terrain well. She looked up and saw a figure approaching, a middle-aged man wearing a faded plaid shirt and work pants marked by dirt. His boots were old but well-maintained, and he walked with an upright posture that contrasted with the simplicity of his clothes. Helen felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because someone was finally there, embarrassment because she knew how she must look. A rich, lost woman, kneeling in the middle of nowhere with a dying animal and a car worth more than most people's annual income. She tried to stand up, but the man made a calm gesture with his hand, indicating that she should stay where she was. He knelt beside her without ceremony, without asking who she was or what she was doing there. His hands, large and calloused, examined the dog with a delicacy that surprised her. He touched the animal's neck, checked its gums, ran his fingers over its swollen abdomen. His movements were economical, precise, like someone who had seen this situation many times before. "He ate something bad," the man said, and his voice had a gentle accent, the kind that comes from someone born and raised in the countryside. "Probably some plant. It happens." Helen wanted to ask 1,000 things. What to do, how to help, if there was hope. But the words wouldn't come out. She just watched as the man carefully lifted the dog and began to gently massage the animal's abdomen. His fingers moved in slow circles, applying pressure that seemed both firm and tender. Minutes passed. The wind continued to blow, stirring up dust from the road and carrying the distant sound of crickets beginning their evening symphony. Helen could feel her own heart pounding, an irregular rhythm that echoed in the silence between them. The man didn't speak, concentrating on his work, and she didn't dare interrupt. And then, gradually, the dog's body began to relax. Its breathing became deeper, less labored. Its glazed eyes blinked a few times, and then focused on the man's face. The animal was still weak, but there was a noticeable difference. It was no longer fighting against something invisible. The man continued the massage for a few more minutes, then allowed the dog to rest in his lap. The animal snuggled there as if it had finally found a safe place. Helen observed the scene with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. There was something almost magical about the man's tranquility, the way he had brought the animal back from a place that seemed to be the end. "He'll be fine," the man said, and there was a serene certainty in his voice. "He just needs rest." Helen finally found her words. "How can I thank you? I can pay you." The man looked at her then, for the first time since he had approached. His eyes were brown, with small wrinkles at the corners that spoke of years under the sun. There was something in that look she couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't disdain, it wasn't pity. It was a kind of patient understanding, as if he knew something about her that she hadn't yet discovered herself. "No need," he said simply. The refusal was so gentle that Helen almost didn't realize she had been rejected. She was accustomed to solving everything with money, to transforming gratitude into a transaction. But the man had simply shaken his head, an almost imperceptible movement, and continued stroking the dog. "At least let me know your name," she insisted. "John," he replied. And then, as a concession, "John Smith." Helen waited for him to ask her name, but he didn't. Instead, John carefully stood up, holding the dog against his chest. The animal seemed to have fallen asleep, its breathing now regular and calm. "There's a vet clinic in town," he said. "About 10 miles from here. It would be good to have him checked out just to be sure." Helen stood up too, her legs trembling after so long kneeling. She looked at her car, which was still dead, and felt a new wave of despair. John followed her gaze, and without her needing to say anything, went to the vehicle. He opened the hood, examined the engine for a few seconds, and did something quick and precise with his hands. Then he returned to the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine purred back to life as if it had never had a problem. "Just a loose wire," he explained, handing Goldie back to her. "Sometimes happens with these road vibrations." Helen received the animal, still warm from his lap, and for a moment their fingers touched. John's hands were rough, but there was a gentleness in that touch that she couldn't forget. She wanted to say something, anything that expressed the magnitude of her gratitude, but the words seemed too small. "Thank you," she whispered, and knew that those 2 words carried much more than she could say. John nodded, a simple, final movement. He walked away from the car and began to walk back in the direction from which he had come. Helen stood there for a moment, watching the figure disappear down the dirt road. There was something almost unreal about the entire scene, the man slowly vanishing against the backdrop of the distant hills, as if he had emerged from the landscape itself and was now returning to it. She got into the car, placed Goldie carefully on the passenger seat, and drove toward the town. But all the way, as the lights of the vet clinic approached on the horizon, she couldn't stop thinking about John's firm hands, the calm in his eyes, and the way he had refused any payment without seeming offended or proud. There was something about that refusal that bothered her, a feeling that mixed admiration and discomfort. In her world, everything had a price. Services, favors, even kindness had their quotes. But John had simply helped and moved on, as if saving a life, even the small life of a lost dog, was the most natural thing in the world. That night, after the veterinarian confirmed that the animal was out of danger, Helen returned to her downtown penthouse. The apartment was too quiet The expensive furniture seemed strangely empty, and she found herself looking out the window toward the hills, where somewhere John Smith was probably getting ready for bed. She didn't know it yet, but that encounter on the dusty road had planted a seed of restlessness that would grow in the following days. For the first time in a long time, Helen Miller had found something her money couldn't buy. The memory of genuine kindness, offered without self-interest, without expectation of return. And that memory, she would discover, was more valuable and more disturbing than any deal she had ever closed in her life. The following days dragged on with unbearable slowness. Helen tried to focus on work, investor meetings, quarterly reports, the company's expansion into the European market, but her mind kept returning to that dusty road and John Smith's calloused hands. Goldie, whom she had named because of his golden fur, recovered quickly and now ran through the penthouse with an energy she didn't remember seeing before. But there was something in the animal's gaze that bothered her. Sometimes, when Goldie was resting on the living room's Persian rug, he would raise his head and look toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Helen knew that someone wasn't her. On Thursday, a week after the encounter, she cancelled an important meeting and drove back to that area. She didn't have a clear plan, just a growing unease that needed to be resolved. She found the road without difficulty, recognized the exact spot where the car had stopped, but there was no sign of John, just dry pasture, an old fence, and the wind carrying the smell of dry grass. She parked and got out of the car, feeling slightly ridiculous. What did she expect to find? That he would appear again, like some kind of rural guardian angel? Goldie, whom she had brought in the hope that he would help her locate John, ran in circles on the grass, clearly happy to be back in that place. It was then that she saw the trail. It was narrow, barely visible among the vegetation, but definitely marked by footprints and constant use. Helen hesitated for a moment. She was wearing high heels and a suit that cost more than a month's salary, but something propelled her forward. Goldie preceded her, following the trail with a confidence that suggested familiarity. The path meandered, through low trees and thorny bushes, gradually climbing a gentle hill. Helen stumbled occasionally on loose stones, but kept walking, guided by a determination she didn't fully understand herself. The sound of her heels on the hard ground echoed incongruously in that wild environment. After 15 minutes of walking, the trail opened into a small clearing where a house stood. It wasn't exactly what she expected, neither as poor as she had imagined, nor as organized as her own meticulously arranged life. It was a simple structure of wood and brick, with a front porch where some plants hung from improvised pots. There was a well-kept side garden with straight rows of vegetables and a yard where some chickens scratched peacefully. Helen stopped at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain about what to do. She had crossed a boundary, left her world, and entered his without invitation. But before she could decide whether to turn back, the door of the house opened. A little girl ran out, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair tied in braids and a simple but clean dress. She stopped abruptly when she saw Helen, her eyes wide with surprise. Behind her came John, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his face expressing polite confusion. "Hi," the girl said, with the natural curiosity of children who haven't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. "Hi," Helen replied, feeling ridiculously formal. She looked at John, who was observing her with that same patient gaze she remembered from the road. I wanted to thank you again, and see if everything's okay." John descended the porch steps, approaching her with calm movements. "Everything's fine," he said simply. "And the dog?" "Goldie's great," Helen replied, and as if he had heard his name, the animal emerged from behind a tree where he was investigating something and ran toward John. The dog's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. He jumped on the man's legs, barking softly and wagging his tail with a joy Helen rarely saw in her silent penthouse. John knelt and stroked the animal, an almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. The girl approached too, extending her small hand for Goldie to sniff. "Dad, he's handsome," she said, and her voice had the direct honesty of children. "He is, Laura," John agreed. Helen watched the scene with a mixture of tenderness and discomfort. There was something deeply intimate in that moment, father and daughter sharing the simple joy of a dog running between them. And she felt like an intruder, a visitor from another planet who had accidentally landed in that small, private universe. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" John asked, and the invitation was polite but without pressure, making it clear that she could refuse without offending him. Helen wanted to refuse. Her schedule was full, she had important calls to make, contracts awaiting her review, but she heard herself saying that would be wonderful. The house inside was larger than it appeared from the outside, but it maintained the same welcoming simplicity. The furniture was sparse but well maintained. There were books stacked on improvised shelves, and the walls were decorated with children's drawings and photographs in cheap but lovingly arranged frames. Helen noticed that many of the photographs showed John and Laura, but there was a woman in some of the older ones, a woman with a sweet smile and eyes that seemed familiar. John prepared coffee in a small but organized kitchen, and Helen sat at the wooden table where Laura was finishing what looked like homework. The girl drew with colored pencils, her tongue slightly out in concentration. Her drawing showed a house surrounded by trees and animals, horses, chickens, and something that could be a golden dog. "It's our house," Laura explained, noticing Helen's interest. "And these are our neighbors." She pointed to the animals in the drawing. "Do you have many animals?" Helen asked, genuinely curious. "Dad takes care of the lost ones," Laura replied proudly. "Sometimes they get sick, and he makes them better again." John returned with 3 cups of coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the fresh air of the house. He served Helen first, then Laura, who received only a little coffee mixed with a lot of milk, and finally sat at the table with them. The coffee was strong, stronger than Helen was used to, but there was something comforting in its honest taste. She took a sip and felt the warmth descending her throat, relaxing muscles she hadn't even realized were tense. "Laura's right," John said, answering the question about the animals. "Sometimes injured animals show up. Hit-and-run cats, abandoned dogs, birds that flew into a fence. We do what we can." "Are you a veterinarian?" Helen asked. John shook his head. "I learn by observing, by trying. My mother always said I had a way with animals." There was something in the way he spoke about his mother, a past tense that suggested absence but an affection that remained present, that made Helen think of the woman in the photographs on the wall. They talked for another hour about small and important things at the same time. Laura talked about school, about her drawings, about the kitten that had appeared the week before with an injured paw and now slept in her bed. John talked about the garden, about the rain that was late, about plans to build a bigger chicken coop. And Helen, surprised at herself, talked about Goldie, about how the animal had brought unexpected joy to her quiet life. When she finally stood up to leave, Helen felt strangely reluctant. There was something about that house, that simple life, that attracted her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't a romanticization of poverty. She knew real poverty, and she knew there was nothing romantic about it. It was something else, a sense of authenticity, of a life lived without haste, without the constant need to prove something to someone. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. And then, impulsively, "If you need anything, I live in the city. I can help." John looked at her with that same patient gaze, and she feared for a moment that he would refuse again. But he just nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. Laura ran to Helen and handed her a sheet of paper, the drawing she had been working on at the table. "For you," she said with the easy generosity of children. Helen received the drawing carefully, touched by such a simple and spontaneous gesture. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant every word. The walk back to the car seemed shorter, perhaps because she now knew the trail. Goldie followed her reluctantly, looking back several times as if wanting to make sure they could return. In the car, Helen placed Laura's drawing on the seat beside her, careful not to wrinkle it. As she drove back to the city, she thought about the strange feeling of having been, for a few hours, part of something different. The meeting she had cancelled no longer seemed important. The calls she needed to make could wait. There was something about that afternoon that was worth more than her carefully planned schedule. That night, in her quiet apartment, Helen taped Laura's drawing to the refrigerator door. It was a small, colourful square amidst the stainless steel and cold marble, but somehow it transformed the entire kitchen. Goldie curled up at her feet as she prepared dinner, and for the first time in months she didn't turn on the television to break the silence. Instead, she sat on her penthouse balcony, looking toward the distant hills where she knew John and Laura were probably having dinner at their wooden table, planning the next day, living a life that didn't need to be justified or measured by any external standard. And as the city lights came on below her, Helen wondered when she had lost that simplicity, when she had traded the possibility of drawings on the refrigerator for financial reports and profit charts. It wasn't that she regretted her accomplishments. She had worked hard to get where she was. But for the first time, she questioned whether she had lost something essential in the process. The night wind brought the distant smell of earth and grass, and Helen closed her eyes, trying to memorize that sensation. Something had changed that afternoon. A small crack had opened in her carefully constructed life, and although she didn't yet know what it meant, she knew she couldn't simply pretend that encounter hadn't happened. Goldie sighed beside her feet, a sound of contentment that echoed in the night's silence. And Helen smiled, realizing that perhaps for the first time in years, she too felt completely present in that moment, in that place, in that life that was hers, but that had somehow begun to feel a little different. The visits became regular, almost ritualistic. Helen found herself inventing excuses to return to that house in the clearing. She would bring toys for Laura, organic market fruits she frequented, books she thought the girl might like. Each time, John accepted the gifts with the same calm courtesy, but there was something in his eyes that Helen still couldn't quite decipher. One Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after their first encounter, she arrived at the house and found John repairing the fence that bordered the garden. He was shirtless, his sun-kissed torso showing muscles defined by physical labor, not by a gym. Sweat trickled down his back as he hammered nails with precise, economical movements. Helen stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching him work, and realized it had been a long time since she had seen someone dedicate themselves to a task with such serene concentration. Laura ran out of the house, followed by Goldie, who had become a constant presence during the visits. The girl wore a yellow dress that was already soiled with dirt, and her hair escaped from her braids in rebellious strands. "Helen!" she shouted, running to hug her with the honest enthusiasm of childhood. John looked up from his work and smiled, a small but genuine smile. "You arrived just in time," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Laura was waiting for you to show you something." The girl pulled Helen by the hand, leading her to a corner of the yard where there was a small wooden structure she hadn't noticed before. It was a dollhouse, but life-sized for a child, with real windows, a door that opened and closed, and even a small chimney on the roof. "Dad made it for me," Laura explained proudly. "It's my playhouse." Want to see inside? Helen knelt to enter the playhouse and was surprised by the attention to detail. John had built small shelves, a tiny table, even hooks on the wall where Laura had hung her drawings. There was something touching in the perfection of that project, in the time and dedication that had obviously been invested in it. "It's beautiful," Helen said, her voice more emotional than she intended. "Dad can do everything," Laura continued. "He fixes things that break, takes care of sick animals, makes delicious food." Helen looked through the small window of the playhouse and saw John returning to work on the fence. There was something deeply moving in the image. A man dedicating his skilled hands to create happiness for his daughter without expecting recognition or applause. "Laura," she said impulsively, "how about I bring some small furniture for your house? I'm sure there are stores that make those kinds of things." The girl clapped her hands, but John, who had obviously overheard the conversation, approached the playhouse. "You don't have to do that," he said softly. There was something in his tone that made Helen pause. It wasn't rudeness, it wasn't ingratitude, it was something else, a kind of careful protection of his independence, of the autonomy he had built for himself and his daughter. "I know I don't have to," Helen replied. "I want to." John studied her for a moment, and she felt as if he was trying to understand something about her that she hadn't yet discovered herself. "All right," he said finally, "but nothing too expensive." It was a small concession, but Helen felt it as a victory, not because she wanted to spend money, but because John had allowed her to be part of something, to contribute to the happiness of that small world. That afternoon, while Laura played in her new playhouse and Goldie ran through the yard chasing chickens, Helen sat on the porch with John and for the first time managed to get him to talk about himself. The story came out in fragments between long silences and sips of coffee. John had lost his wife Mary 2 years prior, cancer, discovered too late. A battle that lasted 8 months and ended on a Sunday morning while Laura was still asleep. He had sold everything he had to pay for the treatment, the house in the city, the car, his savings. But in the end, nothing had been enough. "I didn't know what to do with Laura," he said, looking at his daughter playing in the yard. "Mary was the one who handled those things. School, clothes, everything a girl needs. I just worked." He had moved to that house, borrowed from a distant cousin, in a place where life cost less, and where he could raise Laura away from the painful memories of the city. He had learned to cook, to braid hair, to listen to a child's small but important concerns. "And the animals?" Helen asked. John smiled, the first truly open smile she had seen from him. "That was always my thing. Since I was little, my mom said I had a way with them, maybe because I understood what it was like to be hurt." There was a brutal honesty in that last sentence that made Helen swallow hard. She thought of her own life, professional successes, the luxurious apartment, the bank account that grew every month, and wondered when was the last time someone had truly needed her, not for her money or her connections, but simply for who she was. "Have you ever thought about remarrying?" she asked, and then regretted the question, realizing how intrusive it sounded. John didn't seem offended. "Laura needs stability right now," he said simply, "and I'm still learning to be a single parent." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching Laura run after the chickens, her laughter echoing through the yard. Goldie had given up the chase and was lying in the shade of a tree, his tongue out, clearly content. "And you?" John asked suddenly. "Never married?" The question caught her by surprise. She was so used to asking questions, to leading conversations, that she didn't expect to be questioned back. "Once," she said, "a long time ago. It didn't work out. She didn't mention that. The marriage had lasted only 2 years. that it had ended when her ex-husband said he felt like an accessory in her life, someone to accompany her to social events, but never truly part of her plans. She didn't mention the other relationship attempts that had failed for similar reasons, men who wanted her bank account or who felt intimidated by her independence, or who simply couldn't compete with her dedication to work. "Sometimes it's better alone," John said, but there was a question in his voice. "Sometimes," Helen agreed, "but sometimes you wonder if you missed something." It was the most honest thing she had said in weeks, perhaps in months, and in the silence that followed, she felt that something had changed between them. A small bridge had been built over the abyss of their differences. Laura ran onto the porch, interrupting the moment. "Helen, are you staying for dinner with us?" she asked, with the radiant expectation of children who still believe adults will always say yes to important questions. Helen looked at John, seeking permission. He hesitated for a moment. She could see the conflict in his eyes, between natural hospitality and careful protection of his family routine. "I don't want to intrude," she said, offering him an out. "You're not intruding," John replied, and there was a genuine warmth in his voice that made Helen feel more welcome than she had felt anywhere in years. "But it's simple food." "It's the best food," Laura declared with authority. "Dad makes chicken and rice with beans, and sometimes he lets me help." Helen smiled. "Sounds perfect." Dinner was a strange and wonderful experience for Helen. The simple wooden table, the mismatched plates, the unpretentious conversation about Laura's day at school, and John's plans to expand the garden. There were no candles, no expensive wine, none of the sophisticated rituals she associated with important meals. But there was something more valuable, a sense of genuine intimacy, of belonging, that she hadn't felt in years. Laura chatted about her drawings, her friends at school, the orphaned kitten that now slept in her bed. John listened with patient attention, asking questions, laughing at his daughter's funny observations. And Helen found herself relaxing, letting go of the constant tension she carried on her shoulders, allowing herself to simply be present in that moment. When it was time to leave, Laura hugged her tight and whispered, "Can you come back tomorrow?" Helen looked at John, who was observing the scene with an expression she couldn't quite read. "If your dad says yes," she said. "You can come back whenever you want," John replied, and there was a genuine warmth in his voice that made Helen feel more welcome than she had felt anywhere in the past few years. The drive back to the city seemed longer that night. Goldie slept in the passenger seat, exhausted after a day of running and playing. Helen drove slowly without haste, savoring the strange feeling of not being in a hurry to get anywhere. Her phone had rung several times during the afternoon, important emails, work calls she had ignored. For the first time in her professional life, other things had seemed more important than responding immediately. The idea should have worried her, but instead she felt strangely at peace. In her apartment, as she prepared a bath and shed the scent of earth and grass that had clung to her skin, Helen thought about the contrast between that simple house in the clearing and her luxurious penthouse. Both had their beauties, both offered comfort, but in completely different ways. In John's house, she had felt needed, not for her money or her connections, but simply for her presence. Laura had run to hug her, not because she brought gifts, but because she was genuinely happy to see her. John had talked to her not because she was Helen Miller, the successful businesswoman, but because she was someone who cared enough to show up. That night, she slept better than she had slept in months, and in her dreams, she was back at that simple wooden table, listening to Laura's laughter and watching John's steady hands as he served food, made with care and love. For the first time in years, Helen woke up the next day eager not for a business meeting or an important contract, but for the next opportunity to return to that place where she could simply be herself, where her presence was valued for reasons that had nothing to do with her professional success. And as she ate her breakfast alone in her quiet kitchen, she looked at Laura's drawing taped to the refrigerator and smiled, realizing that something in her life had definitely changed and that she didn't want it to go back to how it was before. The first sign that something was changing came on a Monday morning when Helen arrived at the office and found her assistant with a worried expression. Mark, her minority partner, was waiting in her office, flipping through reports with a tension she immediately recognized. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Helen poured coffee into her porcelain cup, a ritual that usually calmed her, but that morning her fingers trembled slightly. She had missed 2 important meetings the previous week, had left 3 unsigned contracts on her desk, and for the first time in 10 years of partnership, Mark seemed genuinely irritated with her. "Clients are asking where you've been," he continued, spreading documents across the table. "The major corporate client contract expired Friday without your signature. The meeting with the Dutch clients has been rescheduled for the 3rd time." Helen sat in her leather armchair, looking at the papers that represented millions of dollars in business. Numbers that had once made her heart race now seemed abstract, distant. She thought of John's wooden table, the simple plates, Laura's laughter echoing through the yard. "I know," she said simply. "You know?" Mark looked at her with incredulity. "Helen, we're talking about the biggest deal of the year. What's going on with you?" How to explain? How to say that she had discovered a place where time ran differently, where conversations didn't revolve around profits and losses, where she was valued simply for showing up? Mark would understand it about as much as if she said she had decided to become an astronaut. "I'm going through some personal changes," she said, aware of how vague it sounded. "Personal changes?" Mark stood up, beginning to pace the room. "Helen, you are the majority partner of this and company. Your personal changes affect 40 employees and their families. They affect our reputation in the market." He was right, and she knew it. But for the first time, the responsibility she had always carried with pride felt too heavy. She nodded, picked up her pen, and began signing the waiting contracts. But each signature felt like a small step backward, a step away from something she was still learning to value. That afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting with frustrated clients, Helen drove to John's house as if seeking an antidote. She needed that place, that calm, that feeling, that there were things more important than figures on spreadsheets. But when she arrived at the clearing, she found a scene that made her uncomfortable. A car was parked in front of the house, not as expensive as hers, but certainly not belonging in that rural setting. A man in a suit was talking to John on the porch, and from their tense gestures, it wasn't a friendly conversation. Helen hesitated at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to approach or return later. Laura ran out of the house, saw Helen, and waved, alerting the men to her presence. John looked in her direction and gestured for her to approach. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, a tension that contradicted his usual calm. "Helen," he said as she approached, "this is Mr. Carlson. He owns this property." The man in the suit extended his hand to her, his grip firm but impersonal. "Pleasure," he said, but his eyes were already assessing her car, her expensive clothes, trying to place her in that context. "Mr. Carlson was explaining that he needs the house back," John continued, his voice carefully neutral. "His son is getting married, and they want to use this property." Helen felt her stomach sink. "When?" she asked. "By the end of the month," Carlson replied. "I know it's short notice, but my son decided to get married suddenly, and this is the only property we have available for them to live in." There was something in the way he spoke that suggested the decision wasn't as sudden as it seemed. Helen looked at John, trying to read his expression. He had crossed his arms, a defensive posture she had never seen from him before. "John has lived here for 2 years," she said, unable to restrain herself. Carlson shrugged. "The agreement was always temporary. I helped him when his wife passed, but now I need the property for family." Laura appeared beside John, holding her father's hand. There was confusion in her eyes, the uncertainty of a child who sensed the adult's tension but didn't fully understand what was happening. "Where will you go?" Helen asked John. He hesitated. "I'll look for something in town, maybe a small apartment." The idea of John and Laura cooped up in a tiny apartment in the city, away from the animals, away from the garden, away from everything that had brought peace to their lives, made Helen feel physically ill. "How much would it cost to buy this property?" she asked impulsively. Carlson looked at her with renewed interest. "Are you interested?" "Maybe," Helen said, ignoring the warning glance John gave her. "It's a good property," Carlson said, suddenly more friendly. 50 acres, a house, a well. I'm asking 300,000. It was money Helen had in her checking account, an amount she would spend without blinking on furniture for her apartment or a trip, but she knew from John's look that she had made a mistake. After Carlson left, promising to return with the papers the next day, John turned to her with an expression that mixed gratitude and something that looked like anger. "You can't do that," he said. "Why not?" Helen replied, genuinely confused. "Because—" John stopped, running a hand through his hair in a frustration she had never seen in him. "Because I can't accept it." "It wouldn't be a favor," Helen said quickly. "It would be an investment. You would pay rent. And with what money?" John interrupted her. "Helen, I can barely pay the bills as it is." "Do you think I can pay rent on a property worth $300,000? The silence that followed was dense, loaded with truths neither of them wanted to utter. Helen realized for the first time the enormity of the abyss between their financial realities. For her, $300,000 was the value of a small business deal. For John, it probably represented a lifetime of work. Laura looked from one to the other, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Goldie circled restlessly around them, as if he too perceived that something important was being decided. "So what are you going to do?" Helen asked, her voice softer. John looked at the house, at the garden he had planted with such care, at the playhouse he had built for Laura. "I'll find a way," he said, but there was a note of defeat in his voice that broke Helen's heart. "Dad," Laura said, tugging at his shirt, "why do we have to leave? I like it here." John knelt down to his daughter's level, his large hands enveloping her small shoulders. "Sometimes we have to move, sweetie, but we'll be okay, no matter where we are." There was a dignity in that response that made Helen feel even worse. John was protecting his daughter from uncertainty, trying to make an impossible situation seem like just another adventure. That night, Helen returned home earlier than usual. She sat on her balcony, looking toward the hills, where she knew John and Laura were probably making plans to leave the only home the girl had ever truly known. She thought about calling her lawyer, about finding a legal way to help without hurting John's pride. She thought about job offers she could arrange for him in the city. She thought about apartments she could pay for without him knowing. But every idea hit the same reality. Her money, no matter how well-intentioned, represented a form of control that John would never accept. She had grown up in a world where problems were solved with checks and connections. He had learned to solve his own problems with hard work and patience. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mark, probably with more complaints about her work performance. She let it ring. When silence returned, she realized she had come to a crossroads. She could completely return to her previous world, dedicate herself to business, forget about that house in the clearing, accept that some people are born into parallel universes that should never touch. Or she could try to find a way to build a bridge between worlds, even knowing that bridges sometimes collapse. Goldie approached her, resting his head on her knee. The animal seemed to sense her anguish, offering the only comfort he could, his silent and unconditional presence. "What do I do?" she whispered to the dog, as if he could have answers. But in the silence of the night only the wind responded, bringing the distant smell of earth and the memory of a simple world she had learned to love, but that perhaps did not belong to her. The next morning, Helen woke with a clear decision in mind. She couldn't buy the property for John without destroying something essential between them. But she could do something else. She could give up a little of her own world to enter his. The idea was terrifying and liberating at the same time. For years, she had built a fortress of success around herself. Now, for the first time, she considered the possibility of opening the doors, but before she could act on her decision, her phone rang again. This time she answered. "Helen," it was Mark's voice, tense and urgent. "We need to meet now. Something happened." And as she listened to what had happened, an important contract cancelled, a furious client, rumors about her reliability spreading through the market. Helen realized that the time for easy decisions was over. The two worlds she had tried to balance were about to collide, and she would have to choose where she wanted to be when the dust settled. The emergency meeting lasted 3 hours. Helen sat at the glass table in the conference room, watching faces she'd known for years turn into masks of disappointment and concern. Mark presented numbers, charts, projections that showed the impact of her recent absences. The company was stable, but her reputation, and by extension, the company's, was starting to suffer. "Clients need consistency," said Robert, the CFO. "They need to know they can count on you." "And they can," Helen replied, but her own voice sounded distant to her. "They can?" Mark leaned forward. "Helen, you've cancelled 4 important meetings in the last 2 weeks. The mining company contract went to the competition because you simply didn't show up." She wanted to explain, wanted to tell them about Laura's drawings taped to the fridge, about John mending fences with his calloused hands, about the feeling of peace she found in that simple yard. But the words seemed to belong to another language, impossible to translate into that room of steel and glass. "I'll reorganize myself," she finally said. The meeting ended with vague promises and skeptical glances. When she was alone in her office, Helen looked out the panoramic window that showed the city stretching to the horizon. Concrete and glass buildings, cars rushing on busy avenues, people walking hurriedly on the sidewalks, her world, the world she had built with sweat and determination. But now, observing that urban landscape, she felt like a stranger looking through a window. Her phone vibrated. A message from John. "I need to talk to you. Can you come this afternoon?" The tone of the message was different, more formal, more distant. Helen felt her stomach clench. The drive to the house in the clearing had never seemed so long. Traffic was heavy, the cloudy sky threatened rain, and Helen found herself driving slower than usual, as if she could postpone whatever John had to say. When she finally arrived at the property, the first thing she noticed were the boxes. Cardboard boxes piled on the porch, some already sealed, others still being filled. Laura was sitting on the steps, hugging a doll, her eyes red from crying. John came out of the house carrying another box. When he saw Helen, he stopped, placed the box on the ground, and approached her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You're already moving?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Carlson showed up last night with his sons," John explained. "They want to move into the house this weekend. He said he could give us a few more days if we needed them, but—" "But?" John hesitated, looking at Laura, then back at Helen. "But I realized it's better to leave soon. Dragging it out just makes everything harder." There was something in the way he spoke that suggested he wasn't just referring to the move. Helen felt a cold dread in her stomach. "John," she began, "about yesterday." About the offer to buy the property. Forget it, he interrupted her. It's not the money. I mean, it is too, but it's not just that. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Laura, who had stood up and was walking slowly toward the playhouse John had built for her. The girl opened the small door and sat inside, as if she could hide there until everything went back to normal. Then what is it? Helen asked. John ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was starting to recognize. You don't belong here, Helen. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I mean, we're too different. You have important meetings, multi-million-dollar contracts, responsibilities I can't even imagine, and I take care of chickens and plant tomatoes. That doesn't matter to me. But it should, John said, and there was a firmness in his voice she had never heard. Helen, you're pretending our lives can mix, but they can't. Yesterday, when you offered to buy this property as if you were buying a birthday present, I realized how different our realities are. Helen felt tears burning behind her eyes. I just wanted to help. I know, but your help comes with a price I can't pay. What price? John looked into her eyes. And there was a deep sadness there that made her heart pound. My dignity, my independence, the ability to take care of my own daughter without relying on charity. It's not charity, Helen protested. It's what? Love. John shook his head. Helen, you barely know me. You barely know this life. You fell in love with an idea, with a fantasy of simplicity that seems beautiful when you can go back to your penthouse at the end of the day. The words were cruel, but there was a truth in them that hurt more than Helen wanted to admit. That's not fair, isn't it? John gestured toward her car, which looked obscenely expensive against the backdrop of the simple house. Do you think I don't see how the neighbors look when you arrive? Do you think Laura doesn't realize your gifts cost more than I earn in months? Do you think this is sustainable? Helen opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find words, because deep down she knew he was right. She had fallen in love with the idea of a simple life, but she had never seriously considered giving up her complex life. You're right, she said finally, her voice coming out as a whisper. John seemed surprised by the admission. He had prepared for an argument, not a surrender. I fell in love with a fantasy, Helen continued. But it wasn't just about simplicity. It was about you two. It was about Laura hugging me like I was important. It was about you looking at me like I was more than my bank account. It was about the feeling that my presence mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with what I can buy. John remained silent, watching her. But you're right, she continued. I can't have both. I can't pretend I can be part of this life without changing it completely. And maybe I don't have the courage for such big changes. They stood there for several minutes, among the boxes and memories, while the wind rustled the leaves of the trees, and Laura continued to hide in her playhouse. Where are you going? Helen asked finally. I found a small apartment in town, John said. 2 bedrooms near Laura's school. It's not much, but it'll do. Helen imagined Laura in that small apartment, with no yard to run in, no animals to care for, no playhouse her father had built with such love. The image made her feel physically ill. And the animals? I'll try to find homes for them. Laura's kitten can come with us, but the chickens, the others... John shrugged, trying to sound pragmatic, but Helen could see the pain in his eyes. At that moment, Laura ran out of the playhouse and threw herself into Helen's arms, hugging her tightly. Helen? You're not going to let us leave, are you? The girl asked, her words muffled against Helen's shoulder. Can you make Dad change his mind? Helen looked over Laura's head, at John, who was observing the scene with a tormented expression. She knew that a single word from her could change everything. The right offer, a creative financial solution, a promise that she would find a way to make it work. But she also knew John was right, that her money, no matter how well-intentioned, would always be a form of power between them, that she couldn't buy her way into that family without destroying the very things that had attracted her there. "Your dad is doing what he thinks is best for you," she said to Laura, her voice trembling. "And he always knows what's best." Laura pulled away, looking at Helen with confusion and betrayal. "But I don't want to leave. This is our home." "Sometimes we have to leave our homes," Helen said, realizing she was speaking as much to herself as to the girl. "Sometimes it's the only way to grow." That afternoon, Helen helped pack. She held simple plates in her hands and carefully wrapped them in newspaper. She disassembled the table where she had shared so many coffees. She packed Laura's books, the colorful drawings, an entire family's life into cardboard boxes. When it was time to disassemble the playhouse, Laura refused to help. She sat under a tree, hugging the kitten, watching John carefully remove the tiny shelves he had made with such care. "I can take the wood," John explained, as if needing to justify himself. "Maybe I can build something smaller in the apartment," but both knew it wouldn't be the same, that some magic cannot be recreated in smaller spaces. When the sun began to set, the house was empty. The boxes were loaded onto the borrowed truck John had arranged for the move. Laura had fallen asleep in the car seat, exhausted by crying and confusion. Helen and John stood on the empty porch, looking at the place that had been home. The garden was still there, with rows of vegetables that would soon be forgotten. The spot where the chickens had been seemed strangely silent. "I'm sorry," Helen said. "Me too," John replied. They looked at each other, and for a moment Helen thought he might change his mind, that they might find a way to make it work. But then Goldie came running from the yard, as if he knew it was time to leave, and the moment passed. "Goldie can stay with Laura," John said, "if you want. I think he'd be happy in a small apartment if he was with her." It was a gift and a farewell at the same time. Helen nodded, not trusting her voice. "Take care of him," John said, "and take care of yourself." Helen watched the truck disappear down the dirt road, carrying John and Laura and everything that had given meaning to that house. Goldie was beside her, looking too, as if he understood that something important was ending. When the sound of the engine completely faded, Helen sat on the steps of the empty porch and cried. She cried for the first time in years, not the controlled tears of professional frustration, but the kind of crying that comes when life forces you to face truths you weren't ready to see. She had found something real, something that made her feel complete, and she had lost it because she didn't know how to hold on to it without destroying it. On the road back to the city, with Goldie sleeping in the passenger seat, Helen realized she was returning to a life that no longer fit her right. But perhaps, she thought, that was the price of making the right choices. Sometimes doing what's right hurts more than doing what's easy. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way to find a path that wouldn't destroy her life or theirs. But first, she needed to discover who she really was when everything else was taken out of the picture. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of Helen's professional life. She arrived early, left late, signed contracts with a mechanical efficiency that impressed even Mark. The company's numbers climbed again, clients regained confidence, and everything seemed to have returned to normal, except that nothing had returned to normal. Goldie quickly adapted to the apartment, but Helen noticed that the animal constantly searched for something that wasn't there. He would sit on the penthouse balcony, looking toward the distant hills, as if expecting to see Laura running between the trees. At night, he slept at the foot of Helen's bed, but she often found him awake, his ears alert to sounds only he could hear. Helen perfectly understood the feeling. She had removed Laura's drawing from the refrigerator. It seemed cruel to keep it there, a constant reminder of something she had lost, but for 3 nights in a row she took it from the drawer where she had stored it and held it in her hands, studying each colourful stroke, each detail the girl had drawn with such care. At the office, she functioned like a well-oiled machine. She closed the largest contract in the company's history, negotiated expansion into 3 new states, and was featured on the cover of 2 trade magazines. But at night, when she returned home, she felt hollow, as if she were playing a role that no longer fit her right. It was on a rainy Thursday that everything changed. Helen was leaving a meeting when she saw a woman in the reception area holding a small dog, clearly in a panic. The animal, a black stray with white spots, trembled in her arms, breathing with difficulty. "Please," the woman was saying to the receptionist, "someone told me there was a vet clinic nearby, but I can't find it. He was hit by a car, I think." Helen stopped, not quite knowing why. There was something about the scene. The woman's desperation, the injured dog, the sense of urgency that instantly transported her back to that dusty road where it all began. "I know a place," she heard herself say. The woman looked at her with relief, but Helen was already grabbing her car keys, guided by an impulse she didn't stop to question. 20 minutes later, they were at a vet clinic Helen had found on GPS, watching a veterinarian examine the injured animal. The dog had broken a leg, but would be fine with proper care and rest. "Thank you," the woman said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I didn't know what to do. He showed up in my yard yesterday and this morning." "Are you going to keep him?" Helen asked. The woman hesitated. "I'd like to, but I live in a small apartment. I work all day. I don't know if it would be fair to him." Helen looked at the dog, now sedated and resting on an exam table, a small splint on his front paw. There was something about the way he had snuggled against the woman that reminded her of Goldie in John's arms. "I know someone who could take care of him," she said. That's how Helen found herself 2 hours later, driving toward a small apartment downtown, an injured dog resting in a box in the back seat, and a confused plan in her mind. The building where John and Laura now lived was different from anything Helen had imagined. It wasn't a tenement. It was clean, well-maintained, but it lacked air, it lacked space, it lacked life. She climbed to the 3rd floor by narrow stairs, the sound of her heels echoing incongruously in that environment. When she rang the doorbell, it was Laura who answered. The girl looked at her with surprise, then with cautious joy. "Helen!" she shouted, and then quieter. "Dad said you weren't coming back." "Hi, Laura," Helen said, kneeling down to the girl's level. "How are you?" "I'm fine," Laura replied, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Do you want to come in? Dad's making dinner." The apartment was exactly what John had described. 2 small bedrooms, a tiny living room, a kitchen where barely 2 people could fit. But it was clean and organized, and Helen could see touching attempts to make it welcoming. Laura's drawings were taped to a wall. Some furniture from the old house had been adapted for the smaller space. And in a small window, John had managed to put a potted herb garden. John appeared from the kitchen, stopping suddenly when he saw her. There was something different about him. He looked thinner, more tired, as if the city was draining his vital energy. "Helen," he said, and there was a question in his voice. "Hi, John. Sorry to drop by unannounced, but I brought someone you might want to meet." She explained about the dog, about the desperate woman, about how she had immediately thought of them. John listened in silence, and when she finished, he simply nodded and said, "Let's go see him." The dog was awake when they got to the car, his dark eyes observing everything with a mixture of pain and curiosity. Laura fell in love instantly. "He's beautiful," she whispered, carefully extending her hand for the animal to sniff. "What's his name?" "He doesn't have a name yet," Helen said. "How about you choose?" While Laura quietly talked to the dog, John approached Helen. Why did you do this? He asked. Helen thought for a moment. Because when I saw him, I thought of you. I thought of how you cared for Goldie that day, and I realized this dog needed someone who understood what it means to save small lives. John studied her, as if trying to discover hidden motivations. Helen, it's not charity, she hastened to say, and I'm not trying to buy my way back into your lives. I just wanted to do something that made sense. They took the dog to the apartment, Laura carefully carrying him up the stairs. In the small living room, the animal settled onto a cushion Laura improvised, and the kitten they had brought from the previous house curiously approached to investigate the newcomer. I'm going to call him Hope, Laura announced, because he showed up when we needed hope. John and Helen exchanged glances, both touched by the girl's simple wisdom. Do you want to have dinner with us? Laura asked. Dad made spaghetti. Helen looked at John, who hesitated for a moment before nodding. It's very simple, he said. I like simple, Helen replied. Dinner was different from the ones they had shared at the house in the clearing. The space was smaller, the table pushed against the wall to fit in the living room, the city noise coming through the windows, but there was something precious in that forced intimacy, in the way they had to sit closer, in the way Laura spoke more softly so as not to bother the neighbors. How has it been? Helen asked John when Laura went to feed Hope. Difficult, he admitted. Laura misses the yard, the animals. I got a job at a garage, but... He shrugged. But it's not the same. Fixing cars isn't like caring for injured animals. And Laura goes to a school with 25 kids per class. She's cooped up all day between concrete walls. Helen could hear the contained frustration in his voice. John, I have a proposal. He looked at her with suspicion. It doesn't involve money, she quickly clarified. At least not directly. She had spent the last few weeks thinking, planning, imagining ways to build bridges without destroying foundations, and she had finally come up with an idea. I'm thinking of creating an animal rehabilitation center, she said, a place where injured or abandoned animals can recover before being adopted. It would be a business with employees, decent salaries, career paths. John watched her without speaking. I would provide the initial capital, but it wouldn't be charity. It would be a real business, which would need to sustain itself long-term, and it would need someone who truly understood animal care to run the operations. Helen, don't give me an answer now, she said quickly. Think about it. Talk to Laura. See if it makes sense for you. John remained silent for several minutes, watching Laura, who had lain on the floor beside Hope, carefully stroking the injured animal. Would it be here in the city? He finally asked. It could be anywhere, Helen replied. Perhaps on a rural property where the animals would have space to recover properly, where children could have yards and gardens. She could see John considering the possibility, weighing the pros and cons, trying to find hidden catches. And you? He asked. What would be your role? Financial, initially, Helen said honestly. And maybe some administrative work, but I don't understand animals like you do. You would be the expert. And if it doesn't work out? If the business fails? Then at least we tried to do something worthwhile. When it was time to leave, Laura stood up to hug her, and Helen felt that something had changed. There was no longer the despair she had perceived in the girl when she arrived. There was, instead, a small spark of possibility. Are you coming back? Laura asked. If you want me to come back, Helen replied. We do, Laura said, with the simple certainty of childhood. John walked Helen to the door. Thank you, he said, for Hope, and for the proposal. You don't need to thank me, and you don't need to give me an answer right away. Helen, John said as she was already in the hallway, why are you doing this? she thought for a moment. Because I learned that money is for building things that matter, and you taught me what truly matters. Going down the stairs, Helen realized she had found something she didn't know she was looking for. Not a way to buy her way into John and Laura's lives, but a way to create something new, something that honored both her abilities and his, both her capacity to invest and his capacity to care. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly hopeful. Not about guaranteed results, but about possibilities, about the chance to build something that could be both prosperous and meaningful. That night, she took Laura's drawing from the drawer and put it back on the refrigerator, not as a reminder of something lost, but as a promise of something that could still be built. Goldie lay at her feet on the balcony, looking toward the hills, but this time Helen had the impression that he wasn't looking for something lost. He was, perhaps, sniffing the future in the wind. 6 months later, Helen stood on a property 25 miles from the city, watching John install the last gates for the recovery kennels. The land stretched over 15 acres of green pasture and sparse trees, with a renovated house at the center and a series of new facilities built specifically to house injured or abandoned animals. The Hope Animal Rehabilitation Center had become a reality faster than any of them had imagined. The bureaucracy had been surprisingly simple. Local suppliers had offered fair prices, and the rural community had embraced the project with an enthusiasm that caught them off guard. Laura ran between the kennels, checking on the animals like a little supervisor. Hope followed her, now fully recovered and proudly assuming the role of the center's official guide dog. Goldie had joined them 2 months ago when Helen finally admitted that the animal was languishing in the city apartment. "The gate is sturdy," John announced, testing the hinge one last time. "I think we're ready to receive the first animals." Helen watched him work with the same calm precision she remembered from that first day on the road. But something was different now. A renewed confidence, a sense of purpose that had grown with the project. "How many do we have on the waiting list?" she asked. 17, Laura replied before John could speak. She had become the unofficial secretary of the center, keeping detailed records of every animal seeking help. 3 cats, 2 dogs, an old horse nobody wants, and a bunch of small birds. The business had evolved organically. Helen provided the initial investment, bought the property, financed the renovations, created an emergency reserve. John brought his expertise with animals and his unwavering work ethic, and, surprisingly, the combination worked. In the first few months, Helen had divided her time between the center and her company in the city. Gradually, however, she had started to delegate more responsibilities to Mark, spending 3 days a week at the property and 4 in the city. It was a balance she had never imagined possible. "Helen!" Laura called, running toward her with Hope and Goldie following behind. "Did you see? Dad finished building the new birdhouse." Helen turned to where Laura was pointing and saw an impressive structure, a large aviary big enough to allow limited flight, but secure enough to protect injured birds during recovery. John had worked on it for 3 weeks, researching designs, consulting veterinarians, ensuring every detail was perfect. "It's incredible," Helen said, genuinely impressed. John approached, wiping his hands on a towel. "We should receive our first birds next week, 2 flycatchers and a tanager that were found with broken wings." There was pride in his voice, but also something more, a deep satisfaction that came from knowing his work would have a real, measurable impact on the lives of creatures that needed help. "John," Helen said, "can I talk to you about something?" They walked to the porch of the main house, where Helen had set up a simple office she used to manage the administrative aspects of the center. Laura played with the dogs in the yard, her laughter carried by the wind. "The numbers for the last quarter just came in," Helen said, showing John a spreadsheet. "We're operating in the black for the first time." John studied the numbers. and Helen could see surprise in his eyes. Seriously? Seriously? Donations are growing, operating costs have stabilized, and we've started receiving some small contracts from the city council to care for stray animals. Helen smiled. This means it's no longer charity, John. It's a real, sustainable business. John leaned back in his chair, still processing the information. From the beginning, he had insisted that the center needed to be financially viable long-term. He didn't want to depend on Helen's perpetual generosity, no matter how well-intentioned. This also means, Helen continued, that it's time to formalize our partnership. She took a folder from the table and placed it between them. My lawyers have prepared a proposal, 51% for you, 49% for me. John looked at her with surprise. Helen, I can't. Yes, you can. You're the one who understands this operation. You're the one who makes it happen. I provide capital and administrative experience, but this place exists because of what you know, what you've built. John leafed through the documents in silence. Helen could see he was struggling with the offer. Part of him wanted to accept, but another part still resisted the idea of becoming partners with someone with so much more money than him. What if you want to leave the company in the city? He asked finally. The question caught her by surprise, not because she hadn't thought of it, but because she didn't expect John to ask it. I have been thinking about it, she admitted. Mark is pretty much running everything himself already, and I found that I prefer working with animals to working with contracts. That would be a big step, John said. It would, but maybe it's time to take big steps. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching Laura, who had found a lost kitten and was trying to convince it to accept a bowl of milk. The scene was simultaneously common and extraordinary. A girl caring for an animal in need of help, the kind of everyday kindness the center had been created to protect and nurture. Helen, John said finally, why are you doing all of this? It was a question he had asked before, but this time Helen felt she could answer with complete honesty. Because you taught me that there's a difference between being successful and having a worthwhile life, she said. For years, I confused the two. I thought that if I made enough money, if I closed big enough deals, I would feel complete. But you showed me that completeness comes from being needed, from doing work that matters, from being part of something bigger than yourself. John studied her for a long moment. And are you sure this is what you want? This life doesn't have the latest model car. It doesn't have magazine covers. Helen laughed. It has something better. It has Laura running to hug me when I arrive. It has the feeling of knowing an animal will live because I helped create this place. It has coffee shared on a porch and the certainty that I'm exactly where I need to be. John extended his hand across the table. Then I guess we have a partnership. Helen shook his hand, and for the first time since they met, the handshake wasn't complicated by class differences or misunderstandings about intentions. It was the handshake of two partners who respected each other, who shared a vision, who had found a way to combine their talents for something greater than either of them could create alone. That night, Helen stayed for dinner. But unlike the tense meals in the city apartment, this was a relaxed celebration in the spacious kitchen of the renovated house. Laura had set the table with wildflowers she had picked from the fields. John had cooked a stew that smelled of garlic and thyme, and Helen had contributed a bottle of wine she had saved for a special occasion. To the Hope Center, John toasted, raising his glass. To second chances, Helen added. To families. You choose, Laura said. And although she didn't fully understand the implications of her words, there was a wisdom in them that made the adults smile. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields where animals would soon be running free again. Laura was lying in Helen's lap, almost asleep, while Hope and Goldie rested at their feet. "Helen," Laura murmured sleepily, "are you going to live here forever?" Helen looked at John, who was watching his daughter with the paternal tenderness she had learned to recognize and respect. "I'll live here as long as you want me to," she replied. "We want you forever," Laura said with the absolute certainty of childhood. Later, after Laura had gone to bed, Helen and John stayed on the porch talking about plans for the center, about the animals that would arrive next week, about the possibility of expanding to include an educational program for local children. "You know this is going to be hard work," John said. "Sick animals, tight budget, long hours." "I know," Helen replied. "I can't wait." John smiled, a full, genuine smile that she had learned to value above any professional praise she had ever received. "Welcome home, then," he said, and as Helen looked out at the dark fields under the stars, feeling the comfortable weight of Goldie against her feet and hearing the distant sound of Laura talking to Hope through the thin wall, she knew she had found something her bank account could never buy, a place where she was needed, not for what she possessed, but for what she could give, a place where her success would be measured not in profits, but in lives saved. The dirt road that had led to their first encounter still existed, but now it led to something very different from an emergency. It led home, to purpose, to the quiet certainty that some of the best things in life cannot be bought. They can only be built, day after day, with patience, hard work, and the courage to believe it's worth trying. Helen fell asleep that night in the guest bedroom of the house, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the countryside, crickets, wind in the trees, the gentle breathing of animals sleeping safely in nearby kennels. And for the first time in years, she didn't dream of meetings or contracts or missed deadlines. She dreamed of a little girl running through green fields, of a man with gentle hands healing wounds, of a place where love and work were the same thing. Outside, on the porch, 2 dogs stood guard, protecting a family that had learned that home is not where you are born, but where you choose to build something worthwhile. And the next morning, when the sun rose over the Hope Animal Rehabilitation Center, it illuminated not just a property where injured animals came to heal, but a place where human hearts had finally found what it means to be whole. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.